Do you want to be part of something bigger? At Siemens, we use AI to transform the everyday. Our engineering solutions drive innovation and change. We're leading in technology and building a sustainable future. Join Siemens and make an impact to transform the everyday. Apply now and be part of something extraordinary. Visit siemens.co.in/careers.
This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. Okay, I admit it. I really enjoyed researching vampires for the previous episode. So here we go again. Unfortunately, for many reasons, not the least of which is all the murder, but unfortunately, any murder that even hints at someone drinking the blood of the victim is automatically labeled as a vampire murder. And I think that's a little unfair to vampires, to be totally honest. This is that rare instance where I actually wouldn't mind a little bit of that satanic hysteria to be applied. Remember all those times where there was evidence of ritualistic activity in certain murders and everyone jumped on the Satanism bandwagon? Why not then label blood drinkers as ritualistic, Satan-worshipping murderers? Because folklore tells us that vampires drink blood? Kind of lazy, if you ask me. Vampires don't drink blood in a ritualistic manner. It's just food for them. It's lunchtime. Hell, this crazy guy in Sweden, remember? He used a damn gravy ladle. He wasn't performing a ritual. He was eating. So please, just because blood is ingested doesn't necessarily mean vampirism. It could, don't get me wrong, but just consider that the more ritualistic the blood consumption is, the less likely it's connected to vampirism. Anyway, welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to Vampires of the North. The summer rages on, friends, and it feels like everywhere is just really hot. I flew back to Los Angeles last night after a few days in New Jersey, or more accurately called the steam room of the Northeast. But I did find some time to revisit some of the spookier places in my hometown, including a stop at the house where Tommy Sullivan killed his mother back in 1989. If you haven't heard season 1 of The Devil Within, it's available to binge, along with 2 additional full seasons. I also drove down Clinton Road in the daytime, and as always, I was struck by the stark difference between experiencing that beautiful countryside in the daylight, the deep green of summer for miles in all directions, hikers, wildlife, just overwhelming natural beauty. But then at night, it's shit your pants terrifying everywhere you look. Darkness and mystery, strange sounds, and utter isolation extending forever. So yeah, I was there in the afternoon, the hot, sticky New Jersey afternoon. But speaking of season 1, in the 3 years since the podcast was released, tons of new information has come to light, including people who wouldn't talk to me about the case who have since gotten in touch and revealed some pretty incredible things. The existence of physical evidence from that night 35 years ago, even the location of Tommy's living relatives. So there might be a follow-up to season 1 in the near future. But for now, I'm going to follow this vampire thread that I've been tugging on. So what I was looking for were cases of non-ritualistic blood consumption, and more specifically, cases where the murderer let everyone know they were drinking blood because they thought they were vampires or wanted to be thought of as vampires. You know, the really fucked up cases. In the summer of 1988, right around the time Tommy Sullivan was getting ready for his rapid descent into oblivion, there existed a group of teenagers in Minnesota that were really big fans of one particular horror movie that is a bona fide Gen X classic. If you know what movie I'm talking about, don't ruin it for anyone. We'll get to it in a minute. First, it's important to take a second and discuss vampires in pop culture in the 80s. Now, this was the time of Stephen King. I mean, not that now isn't also the time of Stephen King, But his arrival as the American horror writer was cemented in the 80s with too many incredible books to count, most of which would become blockbuster movies. By the way, his non-horror stories would also go on to define entire eras of pop culture. Stand By Me, The Shawshank Redemption. I mean, come on. But his horror stories are second to none. King's second published novel was Salem's Lot, a story about a town in rural Maine whose residents become vampires. This book, published in 1975, was a massive bestseller that brought the idea of vampires to a mass audience in a way that was much different than books like Dracula ever could. No longer were vampires reclusive noblemen in Gothic castles in some faraway foreign land. They were here. They could be your damn neighbors. Over the next several years, King would sprinkle vampires throughout his work, including two of my favorite Stephen King short stories, Popsy and The Night Flyer. So The Night Flyer is about a journalist on the trail of a serial killer who's believed to travel through the Northeast piloting his own small plane. The reporter also happens to be a small plane pilot, which is how he was able to crack the case. He was familiar with all of the small local airports near the murder scenes. But what was interesting was the manner in which the victims were killed. Bites to the neck and drained of blood. The reporter believed he was looking for some whack job who thought he was a vampire. Anyway, the reporter catches up with the killer at a small airport and follows him into the public restroom. He hesitates before going all the way in and just peeks around the corner to catch a glimpse of the killer in the mirror. But he's not there. It's like he disappeared. Until he sees a bloody urine stream hitting the urinal, appearing seemingly out of nowhere. That's when the guy realizes he's chasing an actual vampire. No reflection in the mirror. I won't ruin the ending for you, but it's great. And then Popsy is an even simpler story. It's about a gambling addict who needs to pay off a debt to his Turkish mafia loan shark. To facilitate that payment, the guy agrees to kidnap kids for the Turkish human trafficking trade. And boy, does he pick the wrong kid to snatch from a local mall. The kid's dad, or Popsy, he isn't like the other dads. Suffice it to say, the kidnapper does not get away with the kid. But it's the idea that vampires could be among us in our daily lives that really stuck in the American psyche. And in 1988, a groundbreaking film would tap into that idea in a deep and abiding way with a summer blockbuster called The Lost Boys. A single mother and her two sons looking for a fresh start move into a sleepy seaside community that happens to be infested with vampires. The movie's appeal transcends generational barriers and continues to be a fan favorite to this day. But back in 1988, less than a year after the movie came out in theaters, it inspired two brothers in Minnesota in the worst possible way. Timothy Erickson was 18 in the summer of 1988, and his older brother Mark was 19. They were living on their own, sharing an apartment in the city of St. Cloud, Minnesota. Part of their weekly routine was to stop by the local mom-and-pop video store and rent The Lost Boys. They'd both seen the movie in theaters the summer before and were obsessed. They knew the movie by heart, and they identified not with the hero brothers of the film, played by Jason Patric and the late Corey Haim, but with the villains, with the vampire gang, specifically the leader of that gang, David, played by Kiefer Sutherland. As stated, the Erickson brothers were obsessed, but the younger brother Timothy's obsession would ultimately consume him. An interesting facet of the brothers' life was their willingness to help out people in need. They would open their doors to homeless teens in St. Cloud. In that summer of '88, they had no less than 4 people, 2 guys and 2 girls, crashing on the floor of their apartment. 3 of the 4 were runaways, ranging in age from 13 to 17. But the fourth was a 30-year-old homeless guy named Donald Gall. When it was suggested that they all go camping to get drunk and smoke weed in the woods, sounded like a great idea. Strangely, even for Gall, Not quite sure why a 30-year-old would want to hang out in the woods with a bunch of teenagers, 2 of which were minors. But hey, to each their own, right? No, this was creepy of him. Like a worse, true version of McConaughey in Dazed and Confused. So the group gets to their campsite, and everyone starts getting loaded. Gall goes a little too far, gets a little rowdy with a couple of the boys, and then passes out by the campfire. It was sometime past midnight when Timothy Erickson gets the idea. Hey, this asshole that was kind of bullying us around and drinking all the booze and smoking all our weed, well, we could really be vampires instead of just pretending to be in the mirror at home. So he takes his brother and 2 of the runaways aside and tells them his plan. Basically, let's murder the old dude and drink his blood. Like, that was it. That was the plan. That would make all of their Lost Boys dreams come true. This is where the older Erickson, Mark, balked. He was no murderer. His brother, though, was committed. He took out his camping knife, and after he and the 2 runaways beat the sleeping Donald Gall into unconsciousness with a tree branch followed by vicious kicks to the head, Timothy cuts Gall's throat, and according to police reports, either drank a tin cup full of the blood, or he might have just licked a bunch of the victim's blood off his own fingers. Then he and his brother dragged the body into the calm waters of a shallow stream, and they all went to sleep. The next day, young Timothy just couldn't keep the great news to himself. He needed to brag about how he was a real vampire now. And one of the people he told was a friend named Bob Benedict, someone Timothy and Mark would often discuss matters of the occult with, especially their fascination with vampires. Timothy told Benedict that he had done it. He'd actually done it. He had killed a man and feasted on his blood. And he wondered if Benedict would be interested in joining their vampire cult that he and his brother were workshopping. Benedict said he'd think about it, but then he went home and got hammered and stumbled into the St. Cloud police station to report a vampire murder at a local campsite. Gall's body would be found the next day, and the arrests of the teenagers followed shortly thereafter. The Erickson brothers were arrested and initially denied any involvement in Gall's murder. Little did they know that the victim's blood had already been discovered on articles of clothing collected after a search warrant was executed at their apartment. Further, they had the statement of Bob Benedict, along with the statements from a 17-year-old and a 13-year-old minor who were at the scene and who were now cooperating with police. At trial, Timothy would claim to be in such a deep state of intoxication that intent to kill was impossible. Therefore, first-degree murder should be off the table. But he was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. On appeal, it was argued that mental disease or defect had caused him to commit murder, but the jury didn't buy it and his appeal was unsuccessful. His older brother Mark was convicted of aiding and abetting a murderer to avoid arrest and unlawful interference with a dead body, since he admitted to helping his brother dump Gall's body in the stream. Mark Erickson was sentenced to 2 years in prison. And as far as we know, neither of the Erickson brothers are currently vampires. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following The Devil Within so you never miss an episode. You could also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.